From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, Charlie Chats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. In the last week or so, things have not been looking good for Forbes 30 Under 30 list star and multi-million-dollar brand owner Matilda Djerf. If you're unfamiliar, you're about to be familiar with her, but she is essentially a Swedish influencer known for her clean girl, Scandi girl aesthetic, which I'm putting images up on the screen if you're unfamiliar with those terms. Very much popular on TikTok, has a cult following. In 2019, she started her brand Djerf Avenue. Essentially, things are not looking so fine and dandy though, because Swedish newspaper Aftonbladet, my apologies, I definitely butchered that, recently interviewed 11 employees, both current and ex, finding multiple allegations of mistreatment, bullying and harassment in the workplace, allegedly perpetrated by Matilda Djerf. I need to say it from the start, I am going to be using the word allegedly a lot in this video, and it's not to minimize the allegations themselves, it's more just from a legal perspective. Everything is allegedly to date, okay? So this is not a good look for anyone in business, particularly when your business is founded on being both inclusive and a safe space, which you can find on the Djerf Avenue website in so many different places. They advocate for inclusivity. On their Instagram, you can actually see that they're promoting inclusivity. They have quite diverse models representing the brand, and they also sell a very diverse size range. So it was assumed that those values were being upheld at every stage of the business. But naturally, my TikTok was flooded with commentary about the situation as soon as the report came out and was translated in English. And even now my TikTok feed is filled with Djerf Avenue supporters or ex-Djerf Avenue supporters who are expressing concerns about what on earth they do now with their Djerf Avenue pieces and collection now that they don't support the brand and the person behind the brand. It's a pretty big deal, and I think that this kind of thing doesn't really happen all the time. I think it's really interesting, especially because we've got such a cult following here, which we're going to unpack a little bit later, and how the impacts of someone who has been deemed as this pioneer for inclusivity and kindness then does something allegedly bad, we kind of lose all faith in their character and their brand. And it's interesting to see the impacts of that on social media as well. This isn't the first time that TikTok has had a negative response to this particular brand. Only a year ago, Matilda Djerf had to disable her Instagram after issuing a number of different copyright infringements to creators who were promoting dupes of her items. The response on TikTok was pretty negative because Djerf Avenue had done so well. Unfortunately, in business with successful items, oftentimes fast fashion giants such as Amazon and Shein are going to try and knock off those items with dupes. And basically these creators were just kind of trying to inform their audience that you could buy these items at a much cheaper price point, because Djerf Avenue is not particularly cheap. Issuing out all of these copyright infringement notices was not received well by the audience on TikTok, because ultimately it's not really creators that are promoting them, it's the companies that are ripping you off. Unfortunately though, it's not as simple as that, and Jordan Teresa has made a really interesting video uncovering this particular scandal. I feel like the word scandal is so ridiculous with these types of things because I just don't know how I feel about it. Like every time I go on TikTok, there's a new scandal. Like everything is a scandal these days. If you use the word scandal enough, it loses its meaning. This whole thing is going to blow over on TikTok in a matter of weeks, if not days. The amount of scandals that I see on TikTok means that we're going to move on to the next thing as soon as this stops trending. But I want to pause this one in its tracks because I think that we can leverage from this conversation about Djerf Avenue a whole bunch of other things about the fashion industry and about influencer brand culture as well. So that was a big tangent just then about the word scandal, but I feel like it was a necessary interjection. But people are wondering now, with this background context, whether or not the compounding effect of these two scandals, is there another word I can use? Whether or not these two significant events is enough to tank sales, or worse, cancel its founder.
Or worse, expelled.
And as Katie Robinson pointed out in a similar video, which I'll have linked below, this disappointment with an influencer brand in recent weeks isn't unique to Djerf Avenue. In fact, there have been many conversations coming up on TikTok and social media about disappointment with the quality of product and treatment and brand values of certain influencer brands, which makes me wonder, if a brand is so inextricably linked with its founder, what happens when things go wrong? Can you separate the influencer from the brand when the brand was designed to mimic the style and aesthetic of that influencer? Where mistreatment and exploitation in the fashion industry is so commonplace, where do we draw the line? And are we expending too much energy talking about the Matilda Djerf situation when actually we should be funneling this energy to the fashion industry at large and all of the other issues that exist within the industry? A successful influencer requires nuanced personal branding. To be reductionist, if your personal branding is good enough and successful enough, you're going to sell a lot of products, and ultimately that is the influencer model. You're essentially an advertisement and a personal brand to sell product to your audience. On paper, it's obviously very transactional. I think it's really interesting to remind ourselves, because there are so many psychological effects that prevent us from remembering that this is literally a transactional relationship. But essentially, there comes a time when an influencer who's particularly successful decides that they're going to profit from their marketing as well and starts their own brand, so that the only person that they're advertising for is themselves. Enter the influencer brand. What I find quite interesting about influencer brands is that they're essentially merchandise, but masked as a brand that's needed in the fashion industry if they are fashion. Done right, these brands can be extremely powerful marketing tools to leverage these influencers as multi-millionaire CEOs in the business industry. Done wrong, it can kill the brand, the personal brand of the influencer, and career aspirations in marketing and influencing forever. The purpose of this video, I really want to distinguish between influencer brands and celebrity brands, because I do think there's a bit of a distinction, particularly in how we respond to the CEOs and the brands when something does go wrong. So in my view, to be super duper clear, Rhode and Skims would be celebrity brands. They're owned by Hailey Bieber and Kim Kardashian respectively, who I would say are both very much mainstream celebrities. Yes, they have increased their social capital online through the business of influencing. First and foremost, I would say they're celebrities, and I feel like most people would agree. On the other hand, brands like Chamberlain Coffee, founded by YouTuber Emma Chamberlain, and Maebe, founded by fashion and beauty influencer Molly May, are influencer brands. And so Djerf Avenue fits very squarely over this side of the line. In both cases, we have brands that are capitalizing off of the social capital that have been acquired from their founders as public figures. But I do think there's a very important distinction to be made, and that distinction is that I would say generally we give celebrities more of a pass to do things that we don't agree with, because at the end of the day they feel further removed from us as everyday folk than influencers do. I would say this means that we excuse or at least expect worse behavior from celebrities than we do from influencers, which has the weird effect of us kind of just like blowing it off as celebrity activity and behavior rather than influencers, who I think we do hold to a higher standard when it comes to being relatable. And I think this comes from the very simple fact that generally speaking, influencers begin their careers as everyday people just like us. A lot of them don't have nepotism ties. They've literally just grown a platform on social media. And yes, they're surrounded by, wealth and power and all of these different people and things that they weren't when they started off. We still expect them to have those sort of qualities of humility and human qualities like empathy, because they were in the walks of life that we walked as well, only a matter of years ago. And I think this is why so many influencers hold so much power in selling things to their audience. What this points to is the extent to which an influencer's trust and credibility leads to parasocial relationships. So many of you will understand what I'm talking about and what I'm referring to, but just for transparency, I want to give the definition that I'm using for this video. Essentially, parasocial relationships are one-sided relationships where one person extends emotional energy, interest, and time, and the other party is completely unaware of the other's existence. This is strengthened when the influencer shares sort of personal details about their life, advice advice even, or just information about who they are on platforms such as TikTok, which are typically kind of a little bit more intimate than other platforms. Anyway, all this to say that the platform TikTok has this really, really interesting humanizing effect for people that feel very out of touch. I think we also should talk about the halo effect as well, which is essentially the psychological concept suggesting that we often associate positive qualities to the people with obvious attributes that we as a society consider positive. So a common example is the assumption that an attractive person is nice, smart, friendly, etc. This concept has since been used significantly in the marketing space, particularly in the influencer space, and people like Matilda Djerf, who are conventionally attractive and build their platform on being inclusive and kind, tend to get a bit of a leg up in building big influencer followings. But I think what's really interesting once we involve an influencer brand, the story shifts a little bit, because while the parasocial relationships and the halo effect do help in building these influencers' audiences, once they start a brand, the qualities of the influencer then tend to be expected of their brand. An influencer who promotes integrity would be expected to infuse integrity in their brand. An influencer who promotes kindness is expected to infuse kindness in their brand, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Controversially, I have to ask, is this expectation fair? To unpack this, I thought that the best way forward would be to look at the fashion industry as a whole, because what's so interesting to me about this is that these people have been very successful in the business of influencing, which is a female-dominated industry, and then oftentimes they're going into a completely different industry. For the sake of this video, I'm talking about fashion, as a CEO in the fashion industry, which is actually a male-dominated industry, contrary to popular belief, at least at the leadership level. So what does it take for these people to make it big in the fashion industry? What does it take for anyone to make it big in the fashion industry? And what does this industry even look like? When influencers start brands, their personal brands change completely as well. If they were a fashion or beauty influencer beforehand, their personal social media changes significantly to match their new lifestyle as a businesswoman and CEO. We get insights into this every stage of their business. Sometimes we get taken behind the scenes to photo shoots. Sometimes we get taken into the office. Sometimes we get introduced to their employees. We end up being taken along behind the scenes as if we're coming along with them for this exciting journey, which I actually find really interesting. I really like this type of content. It raises a few alarm bells because it almost feels like we're developing an intimate relationship with not only the influencer, but with the brand. If we like the influencer, we want them to succeed and we want their endeavors to be successful. In Katie Robinson's video, she made a really, really good point that sometimes with these influencers, if they market well enough, their audience would buy anything from them just to support them, just to show their support and be part of the cult-like group that is their following. And evidently here, the optics of success are extremely relevant. We're not only being shown these brands because it markets the brands and it markets themselves, but it also markets them as successful business people. It's all about how it looks from the outside, and unless we're actually perusing the business side of the internet, whether or not their businesses are successful is sometimes completely unbeknownst to the audience. This to me is really, really similar to the 2010s Girlboss era, which was coined by Sophia Amoruso, who you may have heard of. She was the CEO of Nasty Gal. Essentially, it refers to a 21st century woman whose success is defined in opposition to the masculine business world in which she swims upstream. The concept on its face is great. We absolutely need more women in business. We need more women leaders. Awesome. The problem was, during the pandemic around 2020, a lot of people felt that the Girlboss vision was more about optics than it was about success, and that having a female CEO in many cases, including the case of Sophia Amoruso, the person who coined the term, didn't really change anything about the business structure and being more inclusive in the industry at all. In fact, allegations soon came to light of bullying, harassment, and poor workplace practices under her supervision, allegedly. And this wasn't exclusive to her either. It also raised a really interesting question as well about white feminism and how these women, for the most part, were benefiting from white privilege and weren't necessarily paving the way for different minority groups to enter the business as well and to start changing this whole patriarchal capitalist business structure. The pushback against being a girl boss and the whole idea of the girl boss in 2020 wasn't because it wasn't helping with equality, but it was sort of more because it wasn't doing enough. In an article by The Atlantic, it was stated, the current cultural pushback against girl bosses isn't a desire to be done pursuing equality or to stop trying to eliminate workplace disparities. This mode of empowerment was briefly successful exactly because people had become more aware of and uncomfortable with the way that power functions in America. The push to move beyond the girl boss is an acknowledgement that a slight expansion of college-educated women's access to venture capital or mentoring opportunities was never a meaningful change to begin with. Being belittled, harassed, or denied fair pay by a woman doesn't make the experience instructive instead of traumatic. One quote that I found really, really interesting and kind of sparked some of my research in this video kind of reminded me that we can't look at the downfalls of being a girl boss in a vacuum. The author Samida Mukhopadhyay explained why so many CEOs are driven to act in ways that don't align with integrity to succeed in the industry. You're incentivized every single day to work without integrity. We know there's a variety of ways we can use our identities to be marketable. We can make dubious decisions about sourcing. We can make dubious decisions about wages. But when you move with integrity, you start seeing how making the wrong choices might mean the entrepreneur next to you builds that multi-million-dollar business. And you're like, I was in the same place, wasn't I? I did everything right. Women are held to a different standard. How many men start businesses and do all kinds of exploitative things? The reality is that women-owned businesses don't get as much money as men-owned businesses. From an even broader perspective, I think it's really interesting, not to give Joe Rogan a platform, but he made a video that was stitched by Grace Beverley, owner of Tala and also influencer. Essentially, he made this video which made a call to action in his podcast for his predominantly male audience to go and check out who the richest women are in the world and where they got their money. His whole argument was, men, watch your backs because all these women are getting their money from divorce. And like, just, you know, cool. We love that. That's like really peak intelligentsia from him. Grace Beverley very interestingly responded by basically highlighting that there is a disproportionately low percentage of venture capital funding going to women-founded companies, and for this reason, it continues to prevent women from being successful in business like men are.
Google the richest women in the world, like where they got their money from. It's rough. It's rough out there, guys.
I want to talk about it being tough out here because we can talk about it being tough out here. Worldwide, 2% of venture capital funding goes to women founders. If you're listening to this and you're not an entrepreneur, you're going to be like, okay, cool, I don't want to start a business. That's not a problem for me. How many times have we sat next to a man that's been like, oh, the gender pay gap doesn't exist. It's illegal. You can't be paid a different amount for the same job. And therefore, we do have gender equality now. Absolutely not. If you look around and you look at your phone, you look at the software you're using, you look at the clothes you're wearing, I can bet that the very large majority of that will have been made because of venture capital funding. So you look at that list of richest women, right? You look at that list of richest men. What have they done? They have built companies, and they have built companies through getting venture funding. It is almost impossible to grow a big business without getting venture capital funding.
If female CEOs have lower access to venture capital funding to help them out at the starting stages and throughout their business to compete against all of these other businesses, it suddenly incentivizes exploitation. Now, obviously, I'm not endorsing exploitation at all, but it does show us that the problem runs a lot deeper than girl boss CEOs just being nasty bosses. Sometimes, yes, they are, but I think that there is like a broader contextual problem here. Yeah, if women aren't getting as much funding, then what will that endorse? What does that encourage? Just even from like a human nature perspective. The thing is, there continues to be a growing gender problem in the fashion industry though, and by having women step down, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. I feel like we identified that there was a problem. We identified that the solution of the girl boss isn't helpful. I don't know if we've really come up with much of a solution other than that to actually assist. And when you look at the statistics, unfortunately, the problem remains strong and it's growing. So essentially, in October of 2023, the conversation about gender diversity in the fashion industry sort of resurfaced when Sarah Burton's position as creative director at Alexander McQueen was replaced by yet another white Man. In a student newspaper, which is called Shift London, it shared the following in an article about the gender breakdown in fashion leadership. According to a study spearheaded by PwC, a scant 4.8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Among apparel retailers, only 12.5% of women are appointed CEOs. There are more male designers creating clothing for women than there are women, even though women are naturally more attuned to what female customers want. The harsh reality is that an industry aimed at women, monetized by women, is not being run by women. In an article written by The Guardian around the same time, it stated that of the 30 luxury brands in the Vogue Business Index, only 8 out of 33 creative director roles are currently held by women, and only one, Sandra Choi of Jimmy Choo, is a woman of colour. Although you could say, and I think you very much should say, that a lot of the men in these positions do have merit to be there, a really interesting quote from Karen Franklin, who's a fashion and identity commentator. She said that what's not being recognised though is that it is so much harder for people of minority groups to get to the place where we're only considering merit. And also, just because these men do receive venture capital funding and a bigger leg up in the industry if they're trying to start brands themselves, it doesn't mean that they're naturally just more ethical. Like, it doesn't mean that they use that money to go to ethical practices. If anything, I feel like I don't know. Essentially, the fashion industry as a whole has a significant problem of exploitation. We just don't always see it. I think we do, in order to go forward with our investigation, I think we do need to unpack what this fashion problem is. I think there's a lot of disappointment at the moment surrounding influencer-founded brands, which relates in general to quality and sustainability. I think a lot of times we've got these influencer brands that generally are at a higher price point than their fast fashion counterparts, such as H&M and Zara. If you're going to sell something at a higher price point, there's going to be higher expectations about what you're putting out into the world and what your product represents. It's not only merchandise for you. I think there's a growing sentiment right now, at least on social media, that we expect responsibility now. We expect better conditions because we have heard about bad things that are happening in fast fashion companies like Shein. The reason we're coming to you is to see what you can offer us that's different, not only something that has kind of your name and brand tied to it. From my perspective, if a new brand is coming into the industry, into the fashion industry, I'm expecting it to address the concerns about sustainability and ethics. Maybe that's naive, and I do think that a lot of these brands are picking up on that. Djerf Avenue, for example, has heaps of stuff about it being more sustainable and ethical. It's part of its marketing. Tala, Grace Beverley's brand, is always about trying to promote sustainability and ethics. I think that we're seeing, even with Maebe, are seeing this running theme of like timeless basics and wardrobe staples, which are arguably way more sustainable than micro trends. I'm going to circle back to all of this in a moment because I think there's a lot to unpack there, and that's not all sunshine and rainbows. The sustainability police, yeah, she's back. This was really interestingly discussed in Katie Robinson's video that I keep referring to. She commented on the fact that not only has Djerf Avenue received backlash recently on social media, but so too has Molly May's brand Maebe. And this was in relation to claims that the quality was reminiscent of fast fashion quality. Now, Molly May did come out and say that she doesn't support fast fashion and sort of, I think, alluded to the fact that her brand wasn't fast fashion, but people quickly saw on her social media that recent posts tagged mega fast fashion brands. So they were wondering what her definition of fast fashion was. So that sort of made things a little bit difficult for her audience to understand. Again, even Grace Beverley's brand Tala, which is kind of renowned for at least attempting to be more sustainable and ethical, there was a video on TikTok which alluded to an item of clothing that many people in the comments associated with Tala. It was never confirmed nor denied whether or not the item that was being referred to was actually from Tala, but the allegations were that the item was being priced at a very, very high price point for something which is made of polyester, even though I think it was recycled polyester. But even so, people are clearly raising concerns about the materials that they're purchasing for such high prices, and kind of just asking the question, like, what are we putting our money towards? Where's this money going? We want greater transparency. And I think this overarching theme and demand is actually really, really good. Expectations are objectively quite high right now. And again, I think this is fabulous. This is something that we should demand from every single brand. Yes, I think that influencer brands are particularly in the firing line because they're the ones that we're seeing in our feeds on social media, and particularly if you're following these people and you have expectations about what they are bringing forward and putting into their brands. But we can't have these discussions about individual brands without looking at the fashion industry as a whole, because a lot of this stuff is going on. We're just not seeing it as frequently. And this is because the fashion industry is literally built off of exploitation. Like, I can't really put it other than that. And this whole thing is also why I will always raise an eyebrow when someone starts a major fashion brand on track to become like a mega brand in the industry. I'm always going to question why we need more brands, why we need more production in the fashion industry that's already failing so terribly. When a brand claims to be sustainable and ethical, I will always question this, because arguably the most sustainable and ethical thing to do would be not to start a brand at all, especially if it's a fashion brand. I know that's quite extreme, but I think that we need to demand transparency, particularly when brands are stating that they're sustainable and ethical. But also, obviously, if they're not stating any of that, then yeah, we need transparency as well, because what are they doing that we don't know? I also think that sustainability and ethics are really, really big buzzwords right now. As I spoke about before, obviously Djerf Avenue, Maebe, and Tala are all kind of trying to profit off of this illusion that they're timeless, there's some sort of sustainability or ethics built into their brand. That is definitely a marketing technique. Yes, I think it's fabulous that they're trying to be sustainable and trying to be ethical. I think that influencer brands in particular, so much about it is about optics. So much about it is kind of this girl boss illusion, even if they're not using the phrase girl boss, even if they're not dressing in like pink power suits. Do we really need 500 influencer brands that are selling a white t-shirt and an oversized blazer? Do we really need 500 different brands that are selling the same cardigan right now? Where does the waste go? Who deals with the waste? Which communities are then burdened by the waste that then pollutes their waterways and pollutes their agricultural land? When we talk about inclusivity and when we talk about ethics in relation to fashion, we have to talk about it across the board. I think it's really awesome that we're having these conversations in relation to places like Djerf Avenue, when we can clearly see that there has been allegedly poor management and discrimination, poor workplace behavior happening in the core headquarters. We can visibly see that. That's evident. It's in a country like Sweden, which has labor laws, and you just don't expect that. There is so much going on in the fashion industry that we don't see and that isn't spoken about in relation to labor laws and workplace relations. And I think we need to have a look at that as well. We can't be selectively talking about Djerf Avenue and the problem with labor and not talking about these other parts of the fashion industry too. The Orr Foundation, which is based in Accra in Ghana, estimates that approximately 40% of every bale of textiles ends up as waste. Essentially, that means that 40% of everything that's made just is never sold and goes directly to landfill. Fashion doesn't just disappear, and I truly want to emphasize, I'm not trying to be condescending here, but I think that this is just really good to remind ourselves, because I forget this all the time. We just don't see this side of things when we're on social media all the time and in the global north. Like, to be frank, we don't see the impacts of fashion waste. We don't see it unless it's, you know, all over the news. And to be honest, it's very rarely in the news what actually happens to this wastage. When we decide we don't want something like that 2021 micro trend top and we give it away to charity, it likely won't be able to be sold at the charity shop either, because no one else wants that top, and then that goes directly to landfill. And when I talk about landfill, I feel like the word landfill doesn't really emphasize what it actually is. I'm going to put some images on the screen of what clothing landfill looks like, because whenever I think of landfill, it sounds like it's just sort of like neatly falling into the earth and then disintegrating and it turns into soil. Yeah, that doesn't really happen. Hundreds of thousands of people usually in the global south are having to deal with this waste. We talk about trying to be inclusive and ethical in fashion. That includes the entire fashion cycle. That includes where these clothes go, when we're done with them. In an article by The Guardian, the founder of Redress, an anti-waste charity, stated that there's a lot of human toil that goes into our clothes, from the cotton picking, spinning and weaving to the garment workers, and how often they don't see their children because of the hours that they work. To have those pieces trashed in such an uncaring way signifies how misaligned we are to our fellow people in this world. Millions of garment workers in supply chains throughout the fashion industry continue to be underpaid. Concerningly, many companies cannot actually even trace where their fabrics come from and who's actually working to pick the cotton, for example. In fact, in the Baptist World Aid's recent ethical fashion report of 2024, it outlined that around 20% of the global cotton market is tied to slavery. 20% of cotton! So I wanted to circle back and see how these influencer brands are actually doing comparative to the rest of the industry. So I had a look at this website. It's called Good On You, and it's aimed at creating kind of greater transparency for consumers looking to shop sustainably. It's rated over 6,000 brands using various metrics, but also looks at publicly available data to get its information. It actually gave the brand Djerf Avenue a 4 out of 5 on its metrics for sustainability and ethics, although I have to say this was prior to the allegations, so that could change. But to put this into context, the brand Tala was rated a 3 out of 5. Molly May's brand Maebe is yet to be rated. Zara, H&M, and Louis Vuitton have all been rated a 2 out of 5, alongside Skims as well. Essentially, there was a common theme across the board, and every single brand, there was this phrase underneath the information: there is no evidence that it ensures workers are paid living wages in its supply chain. No evidence. Again, that means no evidence. But like, why? Why not? We absolutely can and we absolutely should demand better from companies about allegations that come to light regarding mistreatment, employment practices, etc. But why should that criticism from us stop at the core company headquarters? To genuinely be sustainable and ethical across the board, you need to be heavily involved in each stage. I genuinely think that you would need to be or have your people attend the factories that you're making your clothes in. You would need to know exactly where your materials are coming from. You would need to know exactly who is sourcing your materials, who is picking the cotton, where the raw materials are coming from. And all of that is really, really hard and sometimes impossible. Yes, sometimes brands try their best, and trying your best is the best you can do. That's kind of the point of the phrase. And of course, tracing your materials is expensive. So you probably have to extend significant number of resources, which when you're just starting out a business, you don't really have, particularly if you don't have access to venture capital funding, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Honestly, I think that this video shows we can hold multiple truths at once. It may be controversial to say this, but when influencers found their own brands, they're no longer your friends. Like, they are businesswomen, business people trying to make millions and millions of dollars in an industry that profits off of exploitation if it's fashion. And obviously that feels like quite like significant. Oh my God, they're not your friend. Like, we've been knowing this, parasocial relationships, boring. But I think that it's kind of like good to remind ourselves this, because when you learn more and more and more about the industry, you kind of realize that a truly sustainable and ethical brand doesn't exist. Yes, we can strive to become more ethical. Yes, we can strive to become more sustainable. We should be demanding that not only from influencer brands, but from mega fashion giants. We need to demand greater transparency across the board in the fashion industry. If we're going to circle back and talk about Djerf Avenue, which is where we kind of started, I think one of the major concerns that a lot of people were having were, what do we do with our stuff? We don't want to be seen connected to this brand. We don't want to be deemed to be promoting a brand that we don't agree with their values anymore. What do we do? Well, I think in light of all of this, throwing them out would just be probably one of the worst things you could do if you're trying to come at it from an ethical perspective. If you disagree with what allegedly has been going on at Djerf Avenue because you have common empathy and you want to sort of have your clothing align more with your values, then I think one thing that should align with your values is not throwing it away and not just passing on the burden to other communities to figure out. The other benefit, which is kind of like a hilarious benefit, is that Djerf Avenue is pretty timeless. At the moment, a lot of their stuff is pretty basic. Not many people outside of your echo chamber are going to realize that's a Djerf Avenue t-shirt as opposed to something else. I feel like maybe the timelessness of all of this, or the air quote timelessness of all of this, is that actually when there's a scandal scandal. People can keep wearing this stuff. Djerf Avenue may be more sustainable than many other brands in the industry. We can hold that as a truth. It's great to see a woman CEO. We can hold that as a truth. It doesn't mean anything though to promote inclusivity if it's tokenistic. The fashion industry is really complicated. Business is complicated. I think we're holding influencers to pretty high standards to kind of tick every single box. Is that fair? Possibly not. Should we still hold them to high standards? Yes. Should that mean that we should hold other brands to high standards too? Yes. And I think that just it's really exciting to see so many people upset about something that's unethical. And I think that while we're at it, let's just channel that energy to some other stuff too, because like honestly, TikTok is a powerful app. Like it's a powerful way to move people. It's a powerful way to indicate to big brands and big businesses that a generation or a group of consumers aren't happy with the way things are. And companies, if they really want to keep making profits, companies will move with demand. We have now come to the end of the video podcast, and I just want to say thank you again for your support. It's really, really exciting to see this little platform grow. Once again, as I always say, I will be posting some stuff on Instagram and I'll leave my socials below. And of course, if you're listening on Spotify, please give this a 5-star rating because it actually really does help. And please like this video and subscribe as well if you want to see more. You know the drill. But if you're celebrating Christmas this year, happy Christmas. Hope you have a lovely holiday. If you're not celebrating, enjoy the time off. If you have any, enjoy the time with friends and family. Stay safe. I know this can be a really hard time for a lot of people as well. And if you have any video ideas, leave them down below. Let me know what you think of this whole thing. Let me know what you think about Djerf Avenue and all of the other fast fashion scandals. If you think they're really scandals, if you think it's all just stupid and we should get on with our lives and move on, that will be welcomed too. But yeah, I'll see you next time.